Hamish de Bretton-Gordon is a retired UK Army colonel. He was a commanding officer of UK and NATO nuclear, radiological, biological and chemical reaction troops. Welcome to the program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
I would like to start with your latest interview on Times Radio. You said that you do not think that Russian forces can sustain war in Ukraine for another 2 years. However, NATO's outgoing Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that Europe must be ready for a decade of war in Ukraine. What is your take on that?
Well, I think both comments are probably viable. Certainly what I was referring to is the Russian losses of manpower. The British Ministry of Defence intelligence update recently stated that they believed that Russia had lost over 600,000 troops dead. And for a country the size of Russia to sustain those losses and keep replacing them is certainly, in my opinion, they can do it for little more than 2 years. And one of the challenges that they have is they're sending a lot of untrained soldiers to the front line, which is, again, not sustainable because these soldiers know little more than to pick up a rifle and fight. And consequently, the Ukrainian soldiers who are much better trained are having an effect there. I think also when you look at the recruits coming into the Russian army, predominantly the rich and the elite members of Russian society in St. Petersburg and Moscow, their children have avoided being called up. Now Russia is going to have to start calling them up soon as well. So that's why I'm saying that Russia can't sustain this for certainly up to 2 years. I think conversely, the outgoing NATO leader is highlighting the fact that even a defeated Russia will still be of a danger to Ukraine and the West and will still try and attack us, not necessarily with bombs and bullets, but with cyber and other type of activity. So I think the key thing that I was saying in my Times interview and writing in the Telegraph is this is a key time for Ukraine, and the West and particularly European countries must make sure that they give Ukraine absolutely everything it needs to prevail against the Russians in the next few months, because things could become very more challenging if, as some people are suggesting, President Trump becomes the next president of the United States, and he and his vice president have previously stated that they might withdraw support to Ukraine, but we're yet to see that. So that is where my analysis that Russia can't sustain its current losses for any more than the next 2 years.
If the war in Ukraine would be prolonged and would be continued for another 2 years, what could happen with the Russian side after this 2 years timeline, with their morale, with their forces and with their war objectives, war strategy?
Well, I think there are a number of things to consider here. The Russian economy is very much on a war footing at the moment, and Russia is making more ammunition than most of the NATO countries put together. So it can continue to make ammunition. We know that Russia has lost thousands and thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, and they've lost a lot of aircraft as well. Now, they cannot rebuild those in the numbers to sustain the losses that they've had, certainly over the next 2 years. On the economy side, I think they are beginning to struggle. It's very important that the West, and particularly Europe, make sure that all the loopholes around Russia exporting oil and gas are sealed up, because they're still getting a significant amount of money from those exports. But if the fighting continues at the level that it has for the last 2 years, for the next 2 years, there will be very little left of the Russian army and the Russian military. In fact, the British Chief of Defence Staff said only earlier this week that he believed it would take Russia 10 years to rebuild its military back to pre-war levels. That's pre-24th of February 2022. That might be the case, but I think we're all well aware that Russia will still try and threaten us through other means. So it is a pivotal time, I think, for Ukraine. The big thing that Ukraine's been lacking, apart from ammunition and long-range precision-guided missiles, is air power. We understand F-16s, if they haven't started arriving in Ukraine, will arrive soon. If Ukraine can start dominating the skies, it'll make life for the soldiers on the ground easier. And the other thing that I and other Western commentators have been writing about and discussing in capitals in the West is that we must take the shackles off Ukraine and allow the Ukraine military and government to use the long-range precision missiles like Storm Shadow and ATACMS to hit targets in Russia. It seems ridiculous that Ukraine can't take out the airfields where these missiles and aircraft are being launched from. And a lot of the time, these missiles have been fired at hospitals, like they were at the cancer hospital in Kyiv only 2 weeks. So there are a lot more things that the West can do, I think, to support Ukraine, to make sure that they can prevail now that we know that the Russian military is really struggling with numbers, and morale must be desperate. And there is even, there seems to be unrest in the Russian people, who are finally beginning to realize quite what a desperate situation President Putin is putting their young men in on the front lines in Ukraine.
President Zelensky urged new UK government to lift some restrictions on Ukraine's long-range capabilities, but it seems like even new UK Prime Minister does not want, or he's not ready to lift other restrictions to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles inside Russia. From your perspective, what is your take on that, and is it related to the political process of the United States, or it is just related to the policy of the UK government?
Well, first of all, I think it's an error. I think Sir Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, should be bold and should allow Ukraine to fire Storm Shadow and other long-range missiles that the UK has produced into Russia. Certainly, at the moment, this is a person who's new in post and just getting used to being Prime Minister. And at the moment, he is following the lead of the Americans, who also are restricting use of these missiles, and also the French to some degree. However, I was heartened today to hear from Berlin that the Germans are suggesting that they may well be in a position to give Taurus missiles, which are similar to Storm Shadow, to Ukraine, and allow them to strike into Russia. I think that would be a significant difference. But from the UK's perspective, I am hoping once the new Prime Minister and the new defence team in London get to understand more about the war in Ukraine, they will allow President Zelensky and his team to use these weapons against targets in Russia.
I would like also to cover current situation on the ground in Ukraine. Institute of Study of War reported that Russian side were regrouping their forces in the Kharkiv region and deploying even new forces, new units to the Kharkiv region, to the combat zone there. From your perspective, does Russia have a chance to conduct another counteroffensive there or on other areas on the front lines?
Well, I think it would be strange. It's very clear that when the US and the UK and others gave permission to use long-range missiles in the defense of Kharkiv, that had a significant impact. and it's very clear that the Russians lost a tremendous amount of soldiers. Again, the British Ministry of Defence is suggesting Russia lost 70,000 soldiers in the last 60 days, many of them in the fight in Kharkiv. So I would be very surprised. One key military concept is that you don't reinforce failure. So for me, if the Russians tried to regroup and again attack Kharkiv, they will get the same result, and there will be massive casualties. Whether they have the ability to regroup elsewhere, I think is something to be debated. It's clear that a lot of the new Russian military units are crewed, are staffed by new recruits. It's clear that the Russian new recruits have very little training. In order to be an effective fighting force, you need to train. You need to work tanks with infantry and artillery. So I think they might well be able to get groups of new troops together, but their ability to do anything apart from get out of the trench and charge the enemy, I think or charge the defenders is very limited. So I would be surprised. But again, Russia seems to have very little care for the amount of casualties that it takes, and is prepared to keep throwing its young men into the fight. But I think opinion in places like Moscow and St. Petersburg is beginning to change when people understand quite how many soldiers Putin has sent to their deaths. So I think it is certainly unlikely they'll be able to make any significant breakthroughs, certainly in the next couple of months.
I would like also to cover with you a peace plan of the former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He wrote an article and urged to lift restriction on Ukraine's long-range capabilities and push Vladimir Putin to a deal, to negotiate with Ukraine on any kind of normal terms. Would that work from your perspective? Could this plan work, for example, for Donald Trump? Is it so easy to win the war just to lift long-range restrictions and push Russia to a negotiating table?
Well, it will certainly help. If the shackles are taken off Ukraine leadership and Ukraine military, the ability to strike targets in Russia will have a severe impact on Russia's ability to conduct military operations in Ukraine. That is without doubt. So in that respect, I think Boris Johnson and others who are saying that are absolutely right. Now, whether it will bring a ceasefire and a peace negotiation which satisfies President Zelensky and the Ukraine people, I think is an entirely different matter. Whether Russia is prepared to withdraw from a lot of the places that it has invaded since the 24th of February 2022 is, I'm not entirely sure. However, if they are hit hard enough in their rear areas in Russia, they might well have to. But the absolutely key thing, as Boris Johnson has said at the moment, is to take the restrictions off Ukraine. At the moment, it's been an uneven battle at the moment. Russia is allowed to hit targets all over Ukraine, including hospitals and schools, but Ukraine's not allowed to hit targets in Russia where those jets and missiles are fired from. That sounds to me to be completely illogical and ludicrous. So any activity to try and get those restrictions lifted, I would support very strongly.
If there is a decision to lift these restrictions on Ukraine's long-range capabilities, would Russia be able to protect its skies? Russia has so big territory, and from your perspective, would they be able to deter, to protect, to secure their skies against Western cruise missiles?
I think the Russians would find it very difficult to protect themselves. We only saw last week, and I wrote a story in the UK's Daily Telegraph about it, where air defense missiles have been moved from the front line to protect Putin's palaces in Moscow and in Sochi. And what the Institute of War is saying is that Russia is reassessing its high-value places that need protecting. And if Putin's palaces are considered high risk, then and the air defense has been taken there, then that makes the airfields near the front line, which Ukraine needs to strike, very vulnerable. So, yeah, I think the Russians would really struggle to defend against Western cruise missiles like Storm Shadow and ATACMS and elsewhere, which is why it's so important that psychologically, I think that Ukraine is allowed to use them, and also psychologically for the Russians. If the Russians know that these airfields now become very vulnerable, then that will change their view of things, and hopefully will lead to the end of this war, in the quickest possible fashion, which I think everybody desires and hopes for.
Also, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrsky, said that Ukraine had a realistic plan to retake Crimea, to get back Crimea. He said that this was a secret plan and he couldn't reveal details, but do you believe that Ukraine has a fair chance to do that?
Yes, I think Ukraine does absolutely have a fair chance to retake Crimea. Again, the general is absolutely right in keeping his plan secret as it should be. But we know that the Ukraine Navy has destroyed the Black Sea Fleet that protected Crimea. That has now disappeared. We know that Ukraine is getting more control of the skies. And with all the air defense and the F-16s arriving shortly, if Ukraine can control the skies over Crimea, it will allow the freedom of maneuver to its land forces, its tanks and armored vehicles and Bradleys to be able to take Crimea. So I think Crimea is absolutely in the grasp of Ukraine in the next few months. And by talking about it, I think it's good because Putin knows that if he loses Crimea, he's finished. And that might well bring him to his senses, and we can come to a peaceful settlement sooner rather than later. But absolutely, I think Crimea is in the sights of the generals in Kyiv, and is a distinct possibility that Ukraine could retake it sooner rather than later.
Do you see a possibility for a ground operation to retake Crimea, or you're just talking about long-range strikes and putting more pressure on the Russian side?
Well, I'm sure it would be a combination of everything that you said: maritime operations, ground operations, long-term strikes. Of course, ideally Ukraine will want to take it with the least amount of casualties, but that will be a challenge. But I think now that Ukraine has control of the Black Sea and is getting more control in the skies, then this is very possible. So, and I'm sure Ukraine would like to retake the Crimea with the least amount of damage to its own troops and to Crimea itself. So we shall see, but I think it is very much in its grasp, which it probably wasn't 6 to 12 months ago.
Also, in one of your interviews on Times Radio, you said about laser weapons. You said that Ministry of Defense of Great Britain is working on laser weapons to intercept, for example, drones. Could you please give us some insight into this interesting defense topic?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting development that the British Ministry of Defence announced this week, that they're working on a laser weapon that sits on tanks and armoured vehicles that can take down multiple drones in very short time and at very low cost. One of the challenges that we're seeing in Ukraine is the mass use of drones. Cheap $500 drones that are destroying multi-million-dollar tanks and armored vehicles. and having to use expensive air defense to take these drones down. So if you can have a laser weapon that can take lots of drones down in a short space of time very cheaply, then that is really a silver bullet, if you like. And one would hope that the UK will, get these weapons to the Ukrainian front line as soon as possible. One of the challenges we have in the UK with military procurement and develop of military capability is it takes so long. The British are always trying to make things perfect rather than good enough. And I think the fighters on the front of Ukraine would like a laser that's good enough that could knock down a load of drones rather than wait a few years until it's perfect. So very interesting technical developments. And a few weeks ago, Britain also announced it developed a much bigger laser called Dragonfire to be fitted on ships that would take down the very largest drones and also aircraft. And again, these are the sort of capabilities that Ukraine could really do with right now to help them to defeat the Russian invaders. But I expect these sort of things will not be available for 12 months or so. But let's hope that the British government will push them through the development process and get them to the front line as soon as possible.
Also, General Sir Roland Walker said that the UK armed forces should be ready to fight a war in 3 years. Also, CNN reported then that more and more Baltic and Scandinavian states are returning to conscription. Is there a need for a conscription campaign in the United Kingdom?
Well, it's a very interesting debate. As some people may know, we have a new government now in the UK, and we are having a strategic defence review because it is clear that the British military conventional defence is not a deterrent, certainly not to Putin. And there is the concern that unless we make sure that Ukraine defeats Russia in Ukraine, then NATO countries like Britain will have to get involved in the fight as well. And ideally, we want the Russian threat diminished as soon as possible. We've also been made very well aware of the fight in Ukraine, how many soldiers that you need. And Britain has a very small army, and it has looked at conscription. A lot of the Baltic states have conscription and very large armies. Britain, or the new government in the UK, has dismissed that idea at the moment. But if, as General Sir Roland Walker has suggested only yesterday, that Britain might have to fight Russia in 3 years' time, then we would have to have conscription because we would need the numbers. But at the moment, they're trying to avoid that. But the absolutely key thing, and again, General Walker has been saying this, is that we need to make sure that Ukraine has everything it needs to prevail, but also be prepared to put boots on the ground to fight the Russians as soon as possible as well, if that is also required.
Do you feel support from the British young people, from the British people of the conscription campaign? Is there a appropriate level of support to conduct a conscription in a peacetime?
I don't think there is at the moment. And I've just been giving an interview for the Irish TV. And I think when young people in the United Kingdom and Ireland look at what's happening in Ukraine, they think it's very far away. And they have other things that are concerning them at the moment. The cost of living and a whole host of other issues. So unfortunately, there are not lots of people like myself who are studying the war very closely and trying to analyze what's happening. Part of my job and part of interviews like this that will be seen in the UK is for people to understand exactly the seriousness of what's happening and the fact that Britain, as a NATO country and as an ally of Ukraine, must be prepared to fight as well. And if the UK gets involved in the fight with Russia, then we will need conscription. And the young men and women of this country will have to get up and fight. They might not see that as a necessity now, but their grandparents and great-grandparents did in the Second World War against the tyrant who was attacking Europe then, and also the First World War. So, yeah, at the moment, it's not top of people's lists because they are not focusing on it. But I mean, I think, to reassure people in Ukraine that, if it has to be, then I am sure that the young men and women in this country will fight, as their forebears have done for generations, to protect democracy.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, for your insightful comments, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.
Thank you.